How's it going, everybody? This is International Master Daniel Rensch. This is Chess.com. This is the day we continue with our Pawn Structure 101 video series. In the first installment of the Scheveningen formation, I broke down and talked a lot about the position of the structure with no pieces on the board, to really try to highlight for you what both sides should be thinking about in the bigger picture in terms of the forest through the trees. And then we talked about one of White's most common ideas, that being the f4, f5 breakthrough. What I wanted to do here was do a little bit of that again, except here leave the pieces on the board so that perhaps if I'm trying to highlight a particular maneuver or a common type of development in terms of anticipating White's or Black's plans, etc., maybe I can do so with the pieces. So a little bit more of an intro here, then we're going to talk and continue to display White's ideas, White's attacking ideas in this structure. As I said, we were going to start with White. Like I said, we did the f4, f5 idea, and now we're going to focus on some other things. So basically, again, to talk about the structure, we'll play this early move f4, which is not the most common type of move here. In fact, this particular move order itself in the Scheveningen, with e6 being played on move 5 already, is not the most common these days, and that's because of the carries attack, which is the option for White to accelerate this move g4 because the bishop on c8 has been closed in. A lot of times you'll see players prefer Najdorf type developments, and after White chooses a developing move, whether it's the Sozin or whether it's the main line, those two moves in particular, both running into e6 on move 6. Only then, a particular type of development has been committed for White, and so Black now plays e6 and doesn't have to deal with the carries attack. Of course, there are many other moves for White here in the Najdorf: bishop e2, bishop e3, f3 here. There's a number of moves, and even moves like f4 on move 6 or a4 on move 6. But just wanted to show that this particular move order, actually playing the Scheveningen opening, is not as popular as reaching the structure itself. Like I said, via the Najdorf, or even via the classical Sicilian after knight to c6, which I would still deem as perhaps more popular than the Scheveningen move order itself at the highest levels. It's not that the carries attack is just winning for White, but as has become popular in many, even of the Najdorfs, let's say, the English attacking structure itself for White, to create this chain and then accelerate this pawn storm after it. You could say that if the English attack itself is working well for White and getting a lot of action, that players, if given the opportunity to accelerate that attack with a move like g4 early, would only be licking their chops in terms of tactical chances that White might get, as well as when you involve computer preparation, you see that players are more and more willing to be aggressive and play really sharp moves early and not play slow approaches anymore. So anyway, that's one thing about the particular move order of the Scheveningen itself. But again, to highlight and summarize, so we talked about White's f4, f5 plan particularly. It was actually a Najdorf opening, but positionally trying to expose the light squares in the center with this move, pressure along the diagonal, as well as eventual access into hopefully the outpost square at d5. That was the main idea we highlighted in the first opening, and I'm glad we did, as to me it's one of the most important positional approaches to keep in mind for White. With that said, we're going to move on, and today what we're going to do is focus more on another plan for White, which is, once this sort of structure is reached, the idea of eventually developing a pawn storm with g4 and g5. And then I'd like to, in this video, if I can, give a summary of a good game, a good example of White attacking with this idea, an example of when early g4 can backfire for White, and then modernize this approach and show you something that's a little more theoretically relevant, a game between two super grandmasters, one particular player who likes to play that g4 attacking idea a lot, that involves perhaps a little bit more modern approach for White, which is the retreat of this knight eventually and combining ideas of the pawn storm along with threats of e5. As I said, that e5 is the other, let's say, the third main idea for White in terms of structure: f4, f5, this idea, and then the e4, e5 idea. So in giving you a little preview, that's what I hope to accomplish in today's video. I hope you enjoyed that little summary that we just did. Just wanted to review a little bit more of those ideas, feeling like maybe I overwhelmed you with too much talk about the pawns in the first one. And so now we're going to go ahead and move ahead and review this game that shows White's g4, g5 idea in a successful light, and that is a game between Smyslov and Hort. Obviously, Smyslov being a former world champion. This game is actually taken from the Pawn Structure Chess book by Soltis, but I've modernized it with a little bit of analysis, trying to highlight for you where Black really went wrong, not just to show like Smyslov was a total genius, but also I hope that it can kind of lead into the sort of modern games that we're going to review toward the end of this video. So again, we have a Chichilian. Here we actually see the Paulsen, or let's say Taimanov-Khan move order played. As I said, that Kasparov was one who preferred that move order a lot when he was playing a lot of Scheveningens. In this game, we actually reached a direct Scheveningen move order. The carries attack was not played here for white, but instead the more classical approach, which was the most popular idea back in 1973, which is when this game was played, which is bishop to e2, followed by the standard developments of castles and bishop to e3. Eventually, here white chose f4 first. But once we reach this position here, this is deemed as kind of a critical position, and one that is still reached in today's theory. And at the time, was this type of attacking ideas and this sort of play for white was really just developing in 1973. It was just becoming, it was more of like the bee's knees then, right? It was like all the cool kids were doing it, right? Anyway, all the cool kids were doing it, and we're going to see that Smyslov was a cool kid who was a little bit ahead of his time, being the world champion that he was. We were not really totally surprised by that. Although it should be noted that 73 was a little bit after his reign of dominance. He was no longer world champion in 73. So, in any case, in this position, Smyslov played the move a4, which is a very good move. It obviously slows down black's minority attack, and it's a prophylactic move in the sense that white is putting his control over the space and control over the central squares at a higher value than just an all-out race attack. That's important because I think some players, when they start to play these positions, decide that if you're going to go for the attack, what matters is just developing the tempos first, which I believe in a lot of cases that's ultimately true, especially if you were in positions where it was a true race. Let's say you castled long and the kings are on opposite sides of the board. In those types of positions, often the actual gain of a tempo is much more critical. But inherently, my first advice to players who want to play this g4, g5 idea, as this is a pawn structure series, and so we're trying to base everything on that, I would say that if you're going to play the g4, g5 idea in terms of the structure, you have to be aware of one major potential drawback, which is the potential weakening of the white king. So whenever white is going to do this pawn storm and develop it, especially in variations with bishop e2, where let's say this isn't a Sozin where white's main idea is f4, f5 to weaken these light squares, as we saw in the first game, but white's idea is more to perhaps develop this pawn storm, maybe later on do one of these shots, but really try to gain some space and constrict his opponent. Whenever you're going to open up your king, you have to be aware of the inherent risks. And so if you're just going to play g4, g5, and your opponent gets the same type of counterplay, the difference is that if his counterplay succeeds, let's say in even just the simple task of removing this knight, immediately your center becomes that much weaker to this bishop on this diagonal, the knight if it's still there. And so one of the things that players do if they carelessly sort of try to, impose this idea and aggressively dictate the king side like it's a race position, they're really taking a risk that if black is able to open up the center via his play on the queen side, that your king may actually be the king that's more open in the long run. The king on g1 is a potential big-time weakness whenever you're going to develop this type of pawn storm. And I've played these types of positions as black against younger players, younger masters and experts and good players, but who I feel like didn't understand the risk they were taking, and so they were sort of exposed. It was possible for black to lash out and open up the position because white's king becomes the weaker king of the two, even though he's trying to launch a pawn storm. In the second example, we're going to see a game where I did just that to my opponent and talk about the differences between what I did as black and what black does here. But coming back to the whole point is that a4 is, I believe, the best way for white. If white is ever going to develop these type of attacking chances on the king side, and theoretically you'll see these days that all the cool kids nowadays are always playing this a4 move to slow down b5 before they consider the pawn storm and even the relocating of their queen over here. So remember that the move 10a4 is the main line and the right approach for white to put a higher premium on controlling these squares, as I said before I went on this tangent, before advancing the pawn. That's my lesson for you there. Black plays b6, which is not a bad idea. It's more of a knight arc development. A Scheveningen approach would be to immediately play knight to c6, put pressure on the center, and then play bishop d7, put the rook on the c-file, and depending on how white approaches it, whether he retreats the knight or whether he tries to do the attack flat out, you can get different types of variations where, for example, some variations where positions like this occur and black eventually trades on d4 to lash out with e5, and after the move queen g3 pinning the pawn, black plays bishop to d8, which was the purpose of rook to e8. And these positions are interesting and dynamic and were the topical theory for some time in this line. And so with king h1 obviously being played to advance this pawn. This is sort of the modern way that black might approach the position once a4 is committed, being to play the move knight to c6. But b6 is also a good move, and it's one that naturally puts pressure on the center here, the e4 pawn, and so not a move that I would criticize. In fact, a move that I actually played in my own game, reaching this exact position in the game I'm going to show secondly, with instead my opponent choosing to play king h1 rather than queen e1, and we're going to talk about that when we get to it. But here Smyslov played queen e1, and his opponent played knight b to d7. I would argue that perhaps this development of the knight coming to c6 is more critical in this line, but let's play a few moves here with both sides remaneuvering their pieces and white trying to launch this attack. The move bishop f2 obviously being played to increase his protection over the e4 pawn. Finally, white plays g4, and now advances g5, so we're seeing the subject of today's lecture executed. We're seeing this pawn advance. And after black's knight retreats, white increases his control of the center. And I love how Smyslov played this game. It's one of the reasons I chose it, because he was ahead of his time. He understood he needed to constrict, and then he understood he needed to improve his pieces and put them on the right files and squares before just launching this attack. And ultimately, it was because his pieces were all on active squares that his attack actually succeeded. We're going to make a few more moves to get to the critical moment. Now that there's less pressure on the square e4, white feels that he can move the bishop back to bring the queen over. That's the idea there. White executes this idea, and after the move queen to g3, rook f to e8, bishop to g2, white is still showing, knowing that he's not just launching an attack or being blind. He's playing moves like bishop g2, aware that he needs pieces to protect his own king, aware that he needs pieces on strong squares whenever he's going to play this g4, g5 advance, because there's always the potential that his opponent might try to lash out with a move in the center. And if you're careless and all you've done is aggressively advance your pawns, like I said, your king will become more weak than black's. And we're going to see another example of that. I'll stop talking about it, but I just like how white puts pieces on good squares and continues to remaneuver his pieces before lashing out against black's king. And for those of you who like this g4, g5 advance, I believe that's a mark of someone who knows what they're doing in this type of line. After bishop f8, rook f2, here white finally plays an idea that we're going to see is in our more modern game is a really critical one, a very common one. It's possible here because his opponent does not have pressure against the e4 pawn, and what I'm saying is that the retreat of this knight does a few things. It opens up the d file always, and it also puts the knight on a potentially more dangerous square for attacking chances. The third thing it does, not always the most common thing that happens, but the third thing it does is actually free up the d4 square for potentially another piece like this bishop. So again, for all those of you who are wondering about this g4, g5 idea in the structure, these sort of, really developing and putting your pieces on good squares, and then this maneuver is actually a very common one in the structure to keep in mind and make a mental note of. After the move knight to b4, white went ahead and launched with this move knight e5. You could argue that the knight to b4 is a mistake, but I don't believe that white is really crushing after knight e5 yet. The position is still interesting and dynamic. But you could argue that maybe black's queen d7 move was a mistake and maybe should have done something else, moved it off of this file. But I think that black simply underestimated the improvement of the knight on g4 versus f3, namely the tactical possibilities that all of a sudden opened up because of this anchor on g5. As an example, just a ridiculous example, if a bishop moved and there was a check given, this kind of capture would never be possible because of checkmate ideas. So that's one of the things that exist in this type of battery when you have a queen, a knight, and a pawn. You don't normally hear a battery used to describe a queen behind a knight, behind a pawn, but it's an interesting tactical maneuver for white, and it creates a lot of chances that eventually win Smyslov the game. So after the move knight to d7, he improves his bishop to d4, and this was one of the first moments where I think that the position starts to get out of hand. Black needs to play the move king h8, and I believe he was worried about queen h4 followed by rook lifts, but my computer engine shows that if black comes back and attacks the bishop, if he gets rid of it, it's going to really improve his defense. And if white retreats the bishop, then perhaps the king can come back to g8 because there's no longer tactics on this diagonal. It's a little bit tricky, but the critical idea is that black needed to understand that he could defend the position after knight takes d4, rook h3, which is likely what he missed. After h6 takes, he has this shot g5, leaving the h-file closed, and after queen takes g5, a move like queen to c5, offering a queen trade as he's up a piece and threatening discovered checks would have been a defensive shot. As the theory evolved on this line, I believe that black became a better defender, understanding where shots like that existed. Ideas like queens coming up, exposing diagonals against a king, as well as defending. These sort of things exist in these types of positions. But at this moment, I don't think black realized he could defend that position, and so after the move bishop to d4, he didn't play king h8 and avoid these tactics. He lashed out with the move e5. After takes takes, and rook to f7. Rook to f1. f7 is a huge problem, combined with open board tactics like these mating net ideas I already highlighted. So black was in big trouble here. And after the move rook to e7, white immediately executes a forcing combination that wins the game. It's possible, I guess, that he could have tried to retreat the knight still and defended, but I believe the tactics for white were already pretty overwhelming. And after rook e7, takes, and knight f6 check, all of a sudden black realized that he still can't take the knight due to obvious ideas like this rook falling. After the move king h8 is played, white wins on the spot with the move knight takes h7, what black missed, with tactics coming on rook takes f7 and g6. The mating net is simply too much for black to deal with. After knight takes h7, black played rook e6, but the move king takes h7 loses immediately to either check and check, winning the rook, or mating on the h file, as well as g6 immediately, and just taking this bishop might be good enough to ask for a resignation. So after knight takes h7, black played rook e6, white took f7, moved the king to h1, and after rook to e7, simply played rook f8 check, and black resigned, as after takes, g6, followed by rook h8 is a forced checkmate. So in this game, we saw Smyslov do a few things really well. Okay, first thing was this knight retreat that was followed by a tactical maneuver, improving the position of all the attacking pieces. Not only the queen and the knight, but the bishop coming to d4. His opponent perhaps didn't stress the danger of it, and should have even spent time, even if he was just going back and forth, probably should have spent time just attacking that bishop, but he didn't. And so because of that, I think that white's attack was really powerful when it finally broke through. So, note that when white advanced this g4, g5 idea, he did so with patience, preventing ideas of b5, bringing the rooks to open file, bringing the queen to a good square, and even retreating the bishop here. But there's one critical thing that white didn't do in this position, which is kind of interesting to note as we move on to the next example. He didn't waste the tempo on this move king h1, as it wasn't clear to him that the diagonal was going to become weak, and instead spent those times improving the queen and restricting the b5 advance when he played queen e1 and a4 on moves 10 and 12. So as we move on to our next example, here we see the king on h1. And after my opponent's last move, bishop to f3, I recognized his idea, obviously, to play for g4, as they do in all of these lines. And so I decided to take the more aggressive development and not just bow down to a maneuvering game on the queen side, but to actually put pressure. And as you remember, I highlighted in that first game with Smyslov and Hort, I felt that when possible, the Scheveningen development of the knight, putting pressure on d4, maybe taking it and playing that e5 idea highlighted, or even just tactical ideas we're going to see happen in this game. I believe that's probably the right approach for black, and if you can get this Scheveningen pressure with the knight and have this Najdorf development of the bishop, I think you're in pretty good shape as black to deal with these tactics. So one way for black to deal with this early g4 is to keep this particular tactical shot in mind we're going to see. After knight to c6, my opponent played knight to b3. And again, note that the difference in this position is white's tempo. Instead of having the queen here and perhaps bringing the rook over, maybe more accurate for white before he commits the king to h1. Here, he's already put the king on h1. And after I played rook to c8, that position of the king ended up being exposed when he played g4, which was a mistake. Here, in order to justify this type of approach, he should go back to playing queen e1 or even queen to e2, with eventual ideas, of course, of doing this attack, but preparing to bring the rook to d1, and white still mating kind of a tiny edge, and this is a typical dynamic Sicilian, where white has made the right effort to play a4 and slow down this play, but black is finding counterplay on the c file. So that would have been the game. Down normal lines, queen e2 or queen to e1 was what I was expecting, but he underestimated the idea here, the counter shot for black after g4, and this is a good example of what happens if white extends this idea quickly before improving all the pieces on the squares that they should be on, as Smyslov did. And that particular idea is, if you want to pause your videos, you can, the shot with d5. This is a typical idea, not like some brilliant find by me, but it's a way to expose the king on this diagonal, especially if you've had the time to get this Najdorf development of the bishop, as I call it, the fianchetto, rather than the bishop going to d7. After the move d5, if moves like e5 are played, knight e4, knight takes, d takes, bishop takes, I immediately lash out with knight to b4, hitting this pawn, opening the diagonal, immediately winning back my material, and with it an advantage because these pawns now look silly and overextended, and my counterplay on the queen side will probably rule the day. Even after something like queen f3 takes, I could take here with the knight, but I could also take with the rook, and we believe that black is better here with playing on the queen side. So the simple idea of playing e5 and then taking the pawn doesn't work. Obviously, taking and then taking with the knight can only be worse after a shot like this. Here, winning a pawn back isn't the only thing on black's agenda because of the pin, obviously. And so after d5, the most natural thing to do is therefore to take it, after which I immediately lash out with knight to b4. Taking it is probably also possible, but you'll see one of the main ideas behind this trick, the reason why it works against the early extension of g4 with the king here, is that after takes and knight to b4, there's a new tactical shot that exists, and that is that if he takes here, the g4 pawn is hanging. For example, in the game, he took and I took on g4. This guy's hanging. There's pressure here. The diagonal is something that, leaves white feeling a little bit scared and naked. And as we said, with early g4 and with bad principles, the attack is reversed, and all of a sudden, white's king is the one under fire. So keep in mind this shot of d5 against the early extension of g4. And this was against a player who's roughly 2150, so a good player who just didn't quite fully appreciate the maneuvers of the position and fell prey to this tactical shot. Again, we see it in action. d5, sacrificing the pawn, followed by the Scheveningen development of the knight being useful, right? Not just this development of the knight here, but bringing the knight over to b4. And after the move, knight to b4, my opponent takes on e6. As I said, after d5, the tactical chances favor black because white has so carelessly opened up the king, and we see this idea come into motion here. Just wanted to highlight again that tactical idea is really possible because of this Scheveningen development of the knight and being a little more aggressive on white's center than just developing to d7 as Hort did. So just wanted to point out that small difference. After white took here, I took on g4. My opponent's position is already sort of crumbling at the seams. Bishop to any other square isn't going to change really what happened in the game. Taking on f7 first, before moving the bishop, only brings my rook onto this open file, and after the bishop moves, it's a potential that I could even take here with the queen. One example being that something like this comes into light where a checkmate threat on h2 combined with threats against the f3 bishop should be pretty devastating. So e takes f7 wouldn't help. White played bishop to d4. I simply captured back my pawn. Taking f4 I wanted to make happen here, but surprisingly now it doesn't work as well, even though it seems almost devastating for white that I'm attacking this pawn and the diagonal here. But after the move queen e2, unlike the position before where the f file was already open, and so therefore just taking f3 would be lights out, in this particular position the f file is not open, so taking f3 doesn't necessarily do much. In fact, might just lose time, and the tactical chances could reverse, and white could be getting play. And if I try to take here, well, the fact that he's guarding h2 means that he can actually take this undefended bishop on b7 now. So it's not actually like black is losing, but not necessary, and I simply took back on e6, leaving white in this awkward position with multiple things to deal with in terms of threats. Now queen takes f4 is renewed, and after f takes e6, it was simply overwhelming for my opponent. He made one final blunder with h3. If queen to e2 was played, black is still doing very well after both bishop takes f3, queen takes f3, and ideas like e5, thinking that after takes, knight takes d4, bishop to c5 and the queen threatening coming to the diagonal still gives black a ton of play along these open diagonals and files, and the threat of c2 is still enough for black to be a little bit better. So if he had played queen e2, taking and playing e5 was a shot, as well as simply taking here and giving up this pawn, followed by putting the king to safety, might be enough to really overwhelm white here. One example, again, they can't take b7 because of rook takes f1 check, followed by queen takes h2. So we see the tactics really favor black all of a sudden. My opponent played the move h3 instead of the move queen to e2, after which I simply take on f4 with the queen with the double attack on f3 and h2. Taking here would just... taking on g4 would simply lose on the spot. He played this strange move, bishop e5, but after queen takes e5, h takes g4, bishop to d6, it was still completely devastating for white to deal with all these tactics. So what we saw was an example of when the g4, g5 push works well, in the Smyslov work game. And then we also saw this example already where g4 is coming a little bit too early, especially against perhaps this more dynamic development move. White needs to not be so cavalier with this idea of g4 because of this tactical shot d5. Now, with that said, we have reached roughly 25 minutes here, so I think what we're going to do is we're going to end this one here, and you will have to wait another few days, another week or so to see the next example of how well white can do with those types of attacking chances, a more modern approach by Andrei Sokolov, who's a very strong grandmaster who plays these positions as white. We'll see more of this knight f3 retreat, which is something that we talked about in the Smyslov game, as well as some other interesting things that white can do. And I'm glad we got a good example in, though, of why where g4 and when g4 can actually backfire. So sorry if we digress a little bit from focusing solely on white's perspective, but again, I think this is the right approach. We're seeing the big picture of these pawn structures here. We've seen the f5, f4, f5 idea now. We've also seen the g4, g5 idea, and we've seen examples of when this idea of extending the g-pawn can seriously backfire. So hope you're enjoying it, and we're going to see you around on chess.com.